1.4 billion people around the world are unbanked, like entirely no access to any banking services, and even more are underbanked where they have some limited access.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Clean Techies podcast. This is episode 68 of the show. I'm your host, Silas Maynor, and thank you so much for tuning in to today's episode. As always, if you are a founder in the climate tech space, you can feel free to reach out to me directly via email, which can be found in the description, or you can reach me on Twitter or Slack, whatever you prefer. Honestly, I'm available pretty much anywhere, but always glad to help people who are looking to raise funding, seeking talent, looking for introductions to past guests. Just generally speaking, anything we can do to help you in the space, we're always glad to do so. That's why we started this entire show. So please do feel free to reach out if you are interested. With that, let's get into today's episode. So today we are joined by Kaylin Brown and Kristen Castell to discuss what ShareChange is doing in the microfinance space. We talked a lot about a lot of different things regarding microfinance and how it's important, but also some of the key items that we kind of discussed in general are how ShareChange is focused on helping entrepreneurs in unbanked regions to expand their businesses, which in turn has a positive impact on the local communities. We talked about how the unbanked populations are most affected by climate change for various reasons, which we get into in the show. And then how in many countries, actually women are unable to get loans without a man's signature, and how their solutions can actually help solve that problem for them. We discussed the importance of how microfinance is allowing these people to actually pull themselves out of poverty rather than kind of relying on outside sources, the government. This further cements the future of their countries, which is a really, really impactful item I think is worth mentioning. We discussed. And then also how major financial institutions can really stand to change how they basically deal with impact finance. A lot of interesting things that Kristen was able to bring with her background coming from some of the bigger banks. So generally speaking, just tons and tons of great information in this episode. Really excited to be able to bring this one to you. And before we get into the show, want to make a big thanks to our sponsors, NextWave Partners. NextWave are experts in talent acquisition, recruitment, and retention across the climate tech, renewables, and ESG spaces globally. So if your team is growing or you are looking to make a career change yourself, consider reaching out to NextWave through their website, which is next-wavepartners.com, or you can reach out to one of their consultants directly via their LinkedIn page. So without any further ado, let's get into the show. All right, welcome to the show, Kristen and Kaylin. How are you both doing today?
Really great, thank you. Excited to be here.
It's a great day. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm very, very excited to talk about this. I don't think we've really had this topic on the show in the past, to my knowledge, at least not that I can recall at the moment. So I think why don't we just start with introductions? Do you want to, Kaylin, do you want to go first and kind of just give us a bit of an intro to yourself and how you ended up getting into this space?
Sure. I'm Kaylin. I'm the founder of ShareChange. How I got into this space is like a culmination of moments in my life, but when that was sparked was during a trip to India. I was volunteering at an orphanage in a rural village, and I learned that the children had lost their parents because of predatory lending in the community, a drought, and unethical collection practices of the loans themselves. And that was something that really just changed my perspective in terms of seeing how happy these children were with so little, having lost their families and coming home to Canada and feeling like, wow, I just have way too much. Like all of those things that I thought were important, that my friends think are important, that my family appreciates, like they are not actually what matters in my life. And from there, throughout my journey, I was looking for ways to share some of like the privilege and opportunity that I've had. And I went to a master's in social entrepreneurship, and I just fell in love with financial inclusion and realizing that there are ways to create access to ethical loans around the world in underbanked communities. And that's how I started working on ShareChange. So essentially, we're building an app to motivate people to contribute to life-changing loans to underbanked entrepreneurs.
Very nice. Kristen, you want to give us a quick background on yourself as well, an intro?
Yeah, sure. And I love Kaylin's story and what she's created with ShareChange. I'm an advisor to ShareChange. I'm the COO and head of product for Seeds, which is a fintech startup in the values aligned investing space. And then I'm also a board member of Microdreams, which is a microfinance organization. And my background is more in traditional finance. So most of my career, I worked at large asset managers and banks for the last 15 years, like BlackRock and JP Morgan. And I left 3 years ago to be part of creating Seeds Investor, which is a tech company, and it helps advisors deliver a more intentional and values-aligned investing experience. While I was in traditional finance, I learned about the concept of impact investing. And what that is using money to actually empower companies doing good in the world. So actually doing good for people and the environment while also growing your wealth. And I just fell in love with the concept. It's a way to make money more meaningful. And at that time, in these large financial institutions, I got a lot of pushback. They said, let's not waste time. No one cares about this. And then there was a huge shift the last few years in the pandemic when everyone was saying, oh, wow, like, what do I value? There's all these social inequalities. There's all these climate disasters, and they want to understand where their money is going. How can they actually have an impact with what they spend and what they invest? And I ended up leaving 3 years ago, leaving JP Morgan to be part of creating Seeds for just that in the social entrepreneurship space. So fast forward to a couple of years ago when I met Kaylin and I heard what she was building with ShareChange, and I was so impressed because it's a real way where we can all have some financial wellness in our life. We can have an impact by just where we are, just with a click of a button, be able to actually empower people across the world, have an impact, and actually, save for our own financial wellness in our future. So started getting involved with ShareChange, and what I feel now is kind of everything I'm involved in is in the space of financial inclusion and having that kind of positive impact in the world that I'm passionate about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's quite powerful to hear these kind of backgrounds, two different types of where you came from and how you ended up in the space. I always really like to understand people's journey into the space because I think from my exposure to people on the show, not a lot of people necessarily set out with the intention to figure this out. It's usually some type of life event that really gets them interested in it, or some type of new perspective, right? Which I think is something a lot of people don't necessarily have the opportunity to gain, is a kind of a different perspective. So from there, I think that's a really good place for us to dive in. Kaylin, why don't you talk to us a little bit about microbanking, generally speaking, kind of what it is and why it matters?
For sure. So I'll start by saying that microbanking or microfinance spans a range of products. So that could be credit, as I initially mentioned, savings accounts, just enabling people to put their money somewhere safe, mobile money, as well as insurance and other financial tools that at least I often took for granted prior to my experience in India. Why it matters, I think that to a degree I demonstrated that in my initial story, but there are so many more reasons why this matters. Families may struggle to pay school fees when there's extreme weather, for example, and the following season they might have even better yields, and the children are then not able to go to school, for example, and miss out on a fair amount of their education. The other thing about these loans is that they can enable people to hire others in their community as well, creating jobs. So going beyond just helping people through tough times, there's also an opportunity to have a ripple effect, not only on the community, but the family and future generations of that family, and other individuals who are impacted. 1.4 billion people around the world are unbanked, like entirely no access to any banking services. And even more are underbanked where they have some limited access. So there are a lot of other implications of being unbanked or underbanked. But one of the big things is that climate change affects people in underbanked regions generally more than anywhere else in the world. So in some ways, they are in the greatest need of access to capital. So for example, some farmers will seek loans for weather resistant crops, for irrigation systems as well, and other ways to essentially move through the effects of climate change. And a lot of the world's agriculture actually comes from sub-Saharan Africa. So I think it's really important that we look at how we can empower people with access to services that they need in order to get through tough times and sometimes break the cycle of poverty, in terms of resilience in so many ways. But
Yeah, microfinance is just so important throughout the world. When I learned about it, over a decade ago, I was like, wow, this makes so much sense. You are actually giving typically a woman, a poor woman across the world, access to capital. So like a little bit of money and business training to help her start her own business and then to grow that to provide for herself and her family. And I was like, wow, you're actually like teaching a man or a woman in this case to fish rather than just giving a handout. And that's so empowering individually and for communities. And to what Kaylin talked about, that has huge effects on not just that family and that community, but the whole world, to get actually access to capital to people that wouldn't be banked traditionally with our financial institutions.
Mhm. I think there's two things I want to ask here. One is you mentioned that a lot of the underbanked communities or non-banked communities are the ones that suffer from the effects of climate change a lot. Could we talk about why is that? Is it due to just their location and kind of proximity to the rising sea levels or something of that nature, or does it have to do with the infrastructure itself not being built out?
it's both. So for example, sub-Saharan Africa is particularly struggling with a lot of droughts at this point and historically, but especially now. You'll also see more extreme weather affecting coastal countries, or sorry, coastal communities, for example, as well as the lack of infrastructure. Like a lot of cities are investing in ways to manage rising sea levels and extreme weather. And that infrastructure doesn't exist in a lot of underbanked communities because there is a relationship between being underbanked and, being in a lower income
Mhm.
country or region.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's interesting. The other thing I wanted to just maybe double click on a bit is you mentioned this essence. Well, in essence, what you're doing is helping people in the communities get these opportunities, especially through people who are looking to start businesses. It sounds like focus on the entrepreneurs. I think it's interesting to note to kind of point out that there's been a lot of companies that have tried to essentially, I don't know if you want to say the word enforce or implement kind of Western ideas or Western businesses, and then just go build these businesses in other countries on their own terms, not understanding local communities, et cetera. And I think it's important what you guys are doing because obviously you can't necessarily have these movements unless it's done from within. And plus, also the people who are more locally located will know what the problems are and they'll know how to solve them better. So I think this might be a good point for us to kind of go further into, Kaylee, if you want to take us further into what are the nuances of what ShareChange are doing and kind of break this all down for us.
Yeah, that's such a great point, and that's why, in order to find loans, and people who are interested in borrowing for the platform, we partner with local organizations who already, have grown up in their communities, exist and have a track record, a reputation, as well as practice and iterations in how they best empower their clients. Microfinance, though access to these financial services is so important, if it's not done right, if it's not done ethically, it can actually just be more harmful than helpful. So there's a lot of work going into looking at how can we ensure that we are employing client protection practices and actually creating an impact. And that varies, as you mentioned, from community to community, as well as, even between genders. There's some variation in what is going to be most helpful. There's additional services needed, like, often people do better if they receive financial literacy training or personal initiative training, to learn how to have a growth mindset, for example. But where we come in is that in a lot of these regions, the cost of capital is very high. So microfinance organizations may seek a traditional loan from a traditional bank and then use that to expand their services and break that up into smaller pieces to empower their clients. And the central bank interest rate in Uganda, which is where we're starting our work, is 10%. And the addition of interest on these smaller loans is pretty high in order to cover the cost of underwriting a small loan. So what we're doing is we're fundraising money for these loans from the crowd and providing that to these organizations that are already doing a great job, and providing them access to capital at a lower cost, hopefully eventually driving down the interest rate for the end borrower. And in terms of how ShareChange is doing this and how the app works, is that we're really trying to build this into people's lifestyle. So giving people ways to save bit by bit toward making a loan, whether that be giving up one latte each week, signing up for small monthly amounts that they may want to contribute, and other features that we'll be rolling out soon. But hopefully encouraging people like myself who may not have a lot of money to realize that I can still make a big difference in someone's life, and not actually need very much in order to do that.
ShareChange is such a great example of how technology is empowering, basically us to be able to have an impact across the world in one click of a button. So having, as Kaylin said, with ShareChange, you can have an app on your phone. You can save a little bit each day, each week, each month, make a loan to a micro entrepreneur across the world, and actually save that money, because it gets recycled, right? So that person would then pay it back, but have that big impact. So actually see the impact you're making. And that's super powerful, because I know a lot of people, all of us are looking for more meaning and value. And this is a way we can actually have that positive impact we're seeking, plus save for our own future. So it's what we can say is, financial wellness and the technology. And there's a lot of technology kind of startups now where in financial inclusion and fintech, where it's making it easy for us to all do this, making it accessible to kind of everybody.
Mm-hmm. I am curious a little bit about I think you sort of mentioned it already, but just maybe dive into it a bit more on how this platform is helping to educate people as well, because if they have the proper education on how to deploy finance, etc., it might kind of increase the chances of them succeeding in whatever their endeavors are. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yes. So I think the main thing at this stage is that by freeing up some capital resources, the organizations that we're working with, so starting with Penda Capital, are able to put more of their resources into supportive programming to really increase the effectiveness of the access to the financial service, or the effectiveness of receiving a loan specifically. And the way that they do that at this stage is that they provide financial literacy training, but they also have this really cool approach where they help with business development and entrepreneurial development, the way that we would see an incubator here support startups. And I think that often that educational component can be missing, and it's very important. But ultimately, we would like to begin to start to take some of these learnings and data across our different partners that we end up working with and be able to contribute to research in the space around what is generally the most impactful, what new methods that are being tested and tried are sorry are having the greatest impact, and from there being able to disseminate and share some of that information with our other partners. And um
Yeah, the education is so important, right? I think that a lot of people don't know what microfinance is. And so Share Change is doing a great job at getting the awareness out there that, wow, it's not just like a donation that goes to somebody, which is great, but doesn't actually have this multiplier effect where you're recycling the money. And so educating that your loan can help someone grow a business, and then you can get the money back and then actually be empowered to actually reloan that same money out, which is what Share Change does, all in an easy app. That education is so important. So Share Change is providing both the education, but also the accessibility. And we're seeing more and more kind of platforms do this and help people do this.
Mhm. One thing I wanted to ask about is if you have any, I guess, thoughts or potentially ways you're trying to help with this, because again, I'm not super well versed on this space, is within certain countries, maybe not having the most stable government, or just basically not incentivizing entrepreneurs to build something because of the political risk of just losing everything at some point from a takeover by a local official. Are there any items like that you've seen happening there, or ways that that's improving over kind of generally speaking throughout some of these countries? I'm really, really keen to understand this, because if there's a solution for people to have the money to build these things, I just still curious to understand how people will still be incentivized to build companies internally in these countries, with with the potential of that risk that comes with it.
well, I will start by saying that a lot of these individuals are already running small companies or like informal businesses. Many of the borrowers are involved in the informal economy. Um, and that means that their business is their livelihood. Often they are living hand to mouth, and to be able to get a loan means diversifying their products, for example, which may not even necessarily result in more income so much as diversification and resilience, should demand shift. In terms of political risk, one of the things that we try to do is we put the onus of the currency exchange and the amounts of repayments received on our users as opposed to on the microfinance organization. So that, for me, if I'm not repaid 25, $50, it's not a huge deal. But for the microfinance organization, that can really add up, especially in the case of something like political unrest happening. Uh, there's definitely a lot of work in terms of developing policies and regulations around financial inclusion around the world, but unfortunately, I don't think that there are a ton of amazing examples of how we can prevent political unrest from affecting people. That said, another thing to note is that a lot of the individuals that are seeking loans or who are underbanked are really in rural areas or at that last mile. And what they're doing is so necessary in their community, whether it's, running the local drug shop or, the agriculture and producing food, that demand may not necessarily shift that significantly in those circumstances. But when we look at, small to medium enterprises, it's of course a little bit different, especially in urban areas. So I think that would be an interesting area to research and continue to build ways that we can provide some support in those situations. Kristen, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, no, that was great. I think it's up to all of us, I guess, to build that type of solution in the future. I don't know if there's a good answer. I think, yeah, the more entrepreneurs, the more people feel empowered to build their own companies within kind of any region in the world, I think the better for kind of the societies there. And potentially influencing kind of more progressive change. But there's, I don't know if there's a solution
Yeah,
right now.
I think something that I've heard a little bit about, not too much, that I think could be interesting is through partnerships with larger investment funds that are building on infrastructure, but partnering with other governments, because then they have not just the money to come into these governments to work with them, but also if there's ever an issue, to bring in, the prime ministers of the other countries and say, hey, we need to make sure that this thing goes through properly. No, nothing under the table, please. So
Yeah, I mean, the governments have an incentive, right? Because it's helping their own societies. So Microdreams, which is a microfinance organization I've been volunteering for a long time, we work in the South Pacific Islands, which and some prime ministers of those islands, I think it's Fiji or Tonga, are, they're involved in the actual organization on the ground, South Pacific Business Development, that's actually providing the loans and business trading for the women, right? Because they're incentivized too. Like, they want their economies and the businesses. It's better for kind of the full country. But that's an example where they're not threatened, right? There are small island nations where they're trying to actually just build their economies, and so the government does see it beneficial to get involved.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a process, obviously, of getting things kind of to a very transparent method, but I think we'll get there, obviously, with the younger generation continuing to demand further transparency. I do believe that there's a lot of positive to come out. So let's move on. I guess you sort of mentioned already with Penda, but are there any other major partnerships that you're involved in that kind of can demonstrate who you're working with in ways that people are kind of working collaboratively to solve this issue?
Yeah, so we did a pilot partnership with a solar organization that is already providing loans solar installations and then financing options to entrepreneurs in Mexico. And our pilot loan was to an entrepreneur named Anna. She runs a bakery that employs women, but particularly people with disabilities. And the individuals that she employs often cannot get a job elsewhere. But the cost of energy in Mexico, or at least in the area that she's in, is so high that by getting a solar panel, she was able to reduce her energy costs by 50%. And within a few months, she was able to already hire an additional worker. And from there, as she repays the loan slowly over time, her repayments are less than the cost of, her traditional energy bill. I think that's a really cool example of some of the work that we've done. There are amazing examples of initiatives all over the world that I would be excited to partner with. Solar Sisters is one of them. They're working in a number of countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and what they do is they encourage women to create their own solar business, but provide the financing options for people in those villages to be able to afford that solar upfront. And so they're creating this sort of decentralized power systems across different communities, while empowering women and reducing reliance on fuels that are being used that are not good for people's health, not great for the environment. And those fuels are also expensive, and so a lot of people will be very limited in the ways that they use that fuel, and so children are not able to study for as long at night, for example. And a really cool story I saw was about how the solar enabled the kids to stay in school and do better in school longer term because they had more access to light as well. And because their costs went down, especially after repaying the loan, it was more likely that women were able to continue to pay for school fees for their children. So there's many very interesting examples around the world that, we definitely love to get involved in.
Yeah, one thing I want to, maybe if we zoom out on, based on some of these stories you're telling us, when we look at the macro, if microfinance is kind of deployed in a lot of regions and successfully. What can be the macro impacts on these local communities, or also on more of the broader governments or just society as a whole?
Yeah, generally, I think that impact measurement has been a huge challenge across financial inclusion initiatives, in the sense that some studies have found very modest impacts on borrowers and the overall communities and economies. That said, a lot of borrowers are not necessarily willing to share all of the information about what's going on for them, and a lot of the economies that they're in are still very informal, um, not measured, not paying taxes necessarily. So I think that, I think, Kristen, would you like to jump in on this in terms of some of the work you're doing with microdreams? I think that you have some great wisdom in this one.
Yeah, I mean, the impacts we've seen, like the microfinance and the concept started a couple decades ago with Grameen Bank in Bangladesh with Mohammed Yunus. And since then, it's been, millions and millions, probably billions of dollars that have been deployed across the world as it's spread across the world to actually help these kind of micro entrepreneurs. Just with what we're doing with the organization I work with, Microdreams, and South Pacific Business Development, it's been, tens of thousands of people and millions of dollars that have been deployed over the last 20 years to actually, and recycled, as I was talking about, you actually can recycle the capital to make a huge difference, to actually grow these people's, businesses, families, livelihood. And the whole point is they're lifting themselves out of poverty, right? So this is a system that these organizations are helping put in place, but it's really a way for people to lift themselves up and to change kind of whole communities to actually be empowered to create their own opportunities, their own businesses, and those can grow from, some of the women we work with have, let's say they start with like a small farm, and then they grow into there's a market, and then eventually it's like an enterprise where they're shipping food to different restaurants and they have cars. And then they have extra money. They're paying for their children to go to school. They're paying for their children to now go to college, go all over the world. And we've seen this time and time again. And what that happens at a macro level is you're making systematic change in these poorer countries. And so while not every government, as we talked about earlier, realizes this, for many of these governments, this is like a great thing, right? Because it's coming from the bottom up, where people are getting empowered to actually make change in societies. So I would suggest, like, if people are more interested, you can look up microfinance around the world, and all of the different organizations. And that's what Share Change is as we're launching Share Change, is doing, partnering with more and more microfinance organizations that are having this difference, and letting us all as just individuals have access to be able to actually be part of that impact and that change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's really interesting to hear that. I think that, if we try to envision, obviously the deployment now may not be super transparent, but I think if we can think about the impacts long term, it should be really, really meaningful to a lot of people. And I think that ultimately kind of advance society as a whole, the human race as a whole. So I'm really excited about what you guys are doing here. Sorry, you had a comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that. I think one of the biggest areas that we do see an impact is in terms of the gender gap. Account ownership between men and women, there's a huge gap around the world, is about 9% on average. And I think that it's so important in terms of not only the economy, but women's empowerment, and knowing that, women are often responsible for the upbringing of their children and their families' well-being, that they're more likely to invest in healthcare and school fees. So being able to increase that account ownership, firstly, is just great for overall equity and women's empowerment, but also has a lot of impacts on where we see the money going. And that, I think, will have some really interesting implications in the long
I'm
run.
so glad you brought that up. Yeah, there's a lot of data on that too. that shows where women spend the money that they make through microfinance in that way. And I love how you brought up kind of that equality component.
Yeah, certainly. I think it's extremely important to understand these things, especially the different spending habits and how it can actually make some pretty positive impacts, right? So I think this is very good. One thing I wanted to ask Kristen about is, generally speaking, your experience from your experience, what are some of the big issues that financial institutions kind of the things that they need to change in order to become more inclusive? Because it's my understanding that a lot of these larger institutions are not necessarily taking part in this kind of microfinance economies.
Yeah, so for large financial institutions, and especially a couple of years ago, before there's been this kind of shift in, we do need to think about the impact and what you hear probably ESG, which is bringing in how a company is running based on environmental, social, and governance factors. So that's gotten bigger, but there's still a lot of ways to go in terms of these large institutions and banks becoming more inclusive and really focusing and contributing capital, contributing investment into microfinance and different ways of financial inclusion. I think what actually will help them change, and we are seeing help them change, is demand from their clients, demand from people like us, from investors, and also from the institutions that we all support, companies that we're part of, where we actually invest our money. Having us demand that these large institutions actually focus on this, because we see that this is a huge impact in the world. In the past, a lot of these institutions really just, as they're investing, cared about, okay, so like, what is the shareholder value, right? Like let's just increase revenue at any cost. And what we're finding is more and more they're coming out and saying like, wow, actually a better long-term investment isn't this kind of short-term chasing shareholder value, but it's about stakeholder value, which includes financial inclusion. And so if a company treats its people better and its operations are more efficient, so there's less pollution, et cetera, that's actually a better long-term investment financially too, because people want to work there. There's less lawsuits for that company. The company has more sustainable operations, et cetera. And so you're seeing this slow, but it's increasing momentum shift of these large institutions that are saying, wow, people are recognizing this. This is actually a better way to invest for the long term. And the more we as clients of these institutions and investors say like, this is important to us, we care about this, we care about financial inclusion, we want ways to actually invest, and we think that's actually better for our financial growth and also the world, they're going to focus more, they're going to find opportunities. Some actually tangible ways large banks can do this is invest in companies like ShareChange and others, right? Because it's hard for like this big machine, this big company, potentially with all like what they're focused on, to build their own. But these smaller platforms are more nimble and flexible and innovative, like ShareChange and others. They can actually support these organizations and these financial technology companies having this impact. Eventually, even like these platforms can become part of the larger organizations. They can really empower them. But I think investing more and more into these smaller organizations, making a big difference and empowered by technology, is a way that all these institutions can start shifting and empowering microfinance.
I have a more slightly more specific answer on this in terms of some of the examples of the ways that women are excluded and the ways that gender norms are often at the root of this systemic exclusion. One example is that a lot of microfinance organizations may, depending on the region, require women to have a signature from their husband or another male in their family in order to get a loan or to even just open a bank account. So being able to provide not only some support around, education in that area, but also, looking at policy. So the Alliance for Financial Inclusion is working a lot with governments and organizations more broadly around developing more inclusive policies with a gender lens. Another example would be that women may need slightly different products depending on the responsibilities and situation that they're in. So a younger woman with no children could maybe take on more risk, but someone who is a single mother and responsible for their family, who may have more volatility in terms of their costs or unexpected healthcare costs, may need a more suitable longer term product that might even be coupled with health insurance for their family. And one final example I'll give is that women are less likely to own property, which means that they don't necessarily have the collateral to put up for a loan. Being able to change those requirements and develop new ways to help to ensure that microfinance organizations can continue to be sustainable and hopefully profitable without requiring that is another portion or piece of the puzzle that is being looked at.
Yeah, it goes into the credit scores too. I've seen a lot of organizations, like new startups, that are trying to have a different way of actually crafting someone's credit score, but not based on traditional factors, which is really cool. And so finding a different way than what you said, having property to put up for collateral, to actually judge whether someone is a good candidate for a loan would make it more inclusive to get financing.
Yeah, certainly. I think this is all really, really fascinating to hear these specific points and the more broader points. We sort of kind of talked about it a little bit, but I want to dig into a little bit more around what are some of the big regulatory challenges that are faced, maybe in specific regions with microfinance, or kind of just broadly, if you want to comment on it.
Yeah, so at least I'll start with us here in Canada. There's a lot of regulatory barriers around doing crowdfunding peer-to-peer loans, in terms of that being often classified as a security. And to become an exempt market dealer or a securities company it's quite a mountain to climb. We do have the Ontario Securities Launchpad now, which has increased the ability for entrepreneurs like myself to become regulated. However, the barriers are still pretty intense. As well, just more broadly, there's a lot of concern around anti-money laundering and anti-terrorism financing, particularly in countries where the money is coming from, like Canada and the US, as well as Europe, which is important because, of course, we want to know that the money that we are sending to these communities is actually having a positive impact and not a detrimental impact in terms of funding violence and such. But in order to do that, there's a lot of legwork around checking people's identities, knowing who it is that you're funding. And this also plays, again, beyond regulation into the costs for the microfinance organization in each loan, and ensuring that the people are who they say they are and that their business activities are what they've said they are. I think that fintech is really helping to lower the barriers around regulation. So, for example, you can do an automatic check of someone's identity simply by just taking a photo of their ID, or just having their name and address and checking that against these international databases of people who are on sanctions lists. So I think that those barriers are getting more and more, they're less and less difficult to address as we continue to evolve.
Yeah, that is pretty interesting to me. I never really thought about it from that perspective, that because of the rigor that's required from Western countries, it can potentially provide a barrier to actually achieve some of these things. It's quite interesting, the dichotomy between those. I know we're running out of time here. I do want to certainly get into this topic of education kind of more broadly. So I'm going to just put this to both of you, and then I'm going to lay out a couple items. You can comment on whichever makes most sense to you or you're interested most in. But generally speaking, I'm really interested in the trends overall that you're seeing, or thoughts you have at least on ways you'd like to see things go on education and essentially the social equity aspects. In particular, we often hear a lot of companies, especially myself being in recruitment, that they claim to be kind of focused on ESG and equity and inclusion, but yet they want people from specific backgrounds or very specific schools, right? Whereas many people may not be able to afford those opportunities. So kind of broadly speaking, comments on that, as well as your thoughts for people who want to get into this space, where they might, what they might do to actually get into the social finance space.
Yeah, and I'll take that first. So when I was in school, I did not learn about microfinance or sustainable investing or anything like that. I think it took a long time for that to come even more mainstream and for people to start talking about it. And now it seems like there's all these new courses, right? These are like degree programs in ESG and impact investing and financial inclusion. And in the space, it is still relatively new, like these big firms hiring for, head of our impact investing or head of our ESG. These are all kind of like newly created positions, which is great because they're trying, and these firms are trying to figure out like how to actually empower people to invest with their values and invest more sustainably, et cetera. That said, I don't think you need a specific education to get into this space, right? Like it's great if you do have an interest and you want to study these types of fields or these types of certification programs. But what I've learned is it's really all about experience. And so one of the best things I ever did was, after getting a really great background in just working in financial firms, one of the best things I ever did was actually just go and be part of creating a startup, right? Like getting in, following my passion, taking that big risk to actually just figure it out and follow kind of my passion for this type of investing, this type of making a difference. And then getting involved with Kaylin and ShareChange and being part of it. You learn so much by just speaking with people, by actually just doing things in the space, by figuring out how to create something. There's a huge community now of people interested, which is awesome, because years ago, a lot of people weren't in the space. I feel like a lot of people now understand it, want to get in there, are doing different types of things in the fields of impact investing, financial inclusion, ESG, microfinance. And so there's so many resources. So I would suggest if anyone's interested to really just start reaching out to people in the space, have conversations, see if you can, join a new platform, join a startup, start learning about it. I don't, education's great if you want to go that route, but I don't think that's necessary.
Definitely. I think that I've learned out of all the work that I have done, I've learned the most from actually doing. Mind you, I've had to do a lot of work in doing a lot of reading around regulations, and I didn't have the resources to hire a lawyer, so I needed to put on a lot of hats and have a thirst for learning. Working on a social mission helps with that, but ultimately, there's so many free courses out there, free platforms, where you can access a lot of the information that I learned in a master's program. For example, like design thinking and human-centered design. One of my favorite entrepreneurs dropped out of college to work on his business, and one of the big things that they practiced was that they didn't want to see your resume or hear about your education. They just wanted to know, what are your real life experiences that actually relate to the problem that we're looking to solve, and how can you relate to our customer, as well as bring in a new diverse perspective and challenge what we're doing. So I definitely agree with Kristen. If you want to go the route of education, it can be great, particularly if you're interested in very specific areas of study. But definitely for me, the experience of doing has been the most valuable so far.
Yeah, and I hope that companies realize that. I know, Silas, as you're recruiting for large companies, this space in general is not new, but quote unquote, it is kind of new in terms of the kinds of roles these large companies are creating in the space, which is awesome. Like I said, like for them to want to figure out how to incorporate these kinds of values into investing, for instance. Um, but no one has like not many people have experience in the space. And so showing the passion, showing the determination, showing how you can connect the dots. And like Kayleen said, your real life experience or your real life thought process and trying to connect issues. I'm hoping companies will value that diversity of thought and diversity of experiences, to actually, get the best people to kind of come in and actually solve these issues.
Hmm. Yeah, I think one thing that I've talked about this a lot in the podcast, and I'm really hoping for going forward is that companies start to realize that there's only certain basic skill sets required, unless of course it's engineering or something like that, right? There's very basic skill sets required that you need, and you don't need a 4-year degree to achieve those skill sets. In fact, you probably can achieve those in the course of 6 months, usually by applied, like really focused attention to those skill sets. I'm somebody who had that type of background, didn't go to university and was able to learn those things. So I think that people are capable of it. And I really do hope it changes, because I think the barriers to entry seem very high for even for somebody who comes from a family where education wasn't pushed on me. Society really wanted me to go, right? And it was like really hard to do something different, because people essentially look down upon you a lot in a lot of instances, not every instance. I think technology and innovation in general tend to be a bit more flexible with that. But I do have this thought, because I think if we're going to be inclusive of many entrepreneurs globally, especially people who don't have the opportunity for these educations, we need to be focused on building these skill sets from a much more a lower barrier of entry for people, right? So they can get into the space, maybe boot camps or things of that nature to get them going.
Yeah, I mean,
Because
now with the internet and technology, you can learn anything, right? And so that's why so many people are starting startups right now. The barrier to entry, like you said, is so low. And so for large companies to compete for these really great talents, they also have to be flexible with what the requirements are to get in there.
mhm. Yeah, absolutely. And I guess just to kind of close things off, any final thoughts you want to mention, either of you, on where people can reach you, and just generally speaking, what your vision for the future is and what you're excited for?
Yeah, for sure. So our vision is that we won't need share change anymore, that everyone will have access to ethical financial products, and rather than exit, that we can wind down. um, it's an ambitious goal, and I may not actually see that in my lifetime, but it's exciting to contribute toward driving the accelerated change, toward that in the world as well. um, I think that it's really cool the way that we can contribute to this leapfrog development around the world, where, communities don't need to rely on centralized power, for example. There's decentralized energy systems being built, in a lot of underbanked communities, which is very cool. In terms of share change, you can see us at WeShareChange.com and sign up to test the app. We are launching very soon. It's in review on the App Store, which is exciting. Um, and you can also find ways to contact us there.
Think the world is changing so quickly and there's so many exciting things. My biggest thing is that everyone has the ability and possibility and opportunity to make a difference and also follow kind of what they want. And microfinance is just one way that we see that in action, right? People making their own differences, people imagining what's possible for themselves and actually pursuing it. So that's really cool. There's more and more ways through technology and through different apps like Seeds and Share Change to actually do this, which and it's going faster and faster than ever. So I think there's so many opportunities for people listening to get involved in that. If you want to, I guess, reach me, you can. I'm on LinkedIn mostly, so Kristen Castell at LinkedIn. Also, seedsinvestor.com is the startup I'm COO of. And then the microdreams.org is the nonprofit organization I'm part of. And then, of course, like Kaylin said, we'd love for you to check out ShareChange, WeShareChange.com. Really excited for the launch and to start having a huge impact.
And I know I said we were going to wrap things up, but there was one thing that Kaylin mentioned that I do want to ask her about as well, which was you talked about, you just mentioned recently, winding down rather than exiting. How do you relay this to the people working on this vision, that kind of mentality? Because it's really kind of counterintuitive to what building a company is, and a lot of people are kind of seeking the exit, et cetera. Could you talk a little bit about how you instill that into the culture and how you're maintaining that? Because that's extremely difficult to do from what I've seen in talent advisory.
Right. Well, I think that's the really cool thing about social enterprise is that we're working toward a mission. Profits are the means to achieve that mission and that impact. We're using the power of business in order to do that. But I think that, a lot of impact investors, especially like true impact investment funds, actually want to see those metrics. Of course, they do want to make money. That's why they exist. But I think that the important thing is really bringing people on in the first place who care about the mission and who are driven to work toward that beyond just their personal benefit from being a part of this. And that's a really key thing that I look at when I look at bringing on a team member. It's funny because it's something that I heard at a talk, and it did sound so counterintuitive to me, this idea that we are hoping to wind down rather than to exit. The truth is that a lot of these inequities around the world probably will continue to exist. Like, we've made a huge dent in financial exclusion around the world, but there are a lot of challenges that may continue to exist for a lot of years. So is it realistic? It's hard to say, probably not, but that is the goal, and that is the mindset that I would like to embed into our culture and our team. It's not about us. This is something greater than me, greater than ShareChange. It's about the impact.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is really powerful. I really appreciate that final closing thought. I think it's a really great place to end it. Thank you both for coming on the show, and really excited that we're able to have this discussion, and super excited at what you guys are doing.
Thanks so much. Great to be here. Thanks for focusing on this.
Absolutely. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for listening to this episode today. Really hope you enjoyed what we talked about with Kristen and Kaylin. I think it was very interesting for me, at least, to learn about a lot of these things. This is a topic I had not previously discussed on the show. I have only talked very, very briefly with people kind of outside of the show on this. So it's really great to learn more about how they're doing things with ShareChange and how they're impacting the world in a very positive way. As always, please do share this with somebody who might find it interesting. Perhaps we know somebody who's interested in the space, wants to learn more. Obviously, at the end of the show, they both gave their advice on getting into impact finance. So if you know somebody who's looking to do that, perhaps consider sharing with them. And then, of course, reach out to Kristen and Kaylin separately on LinkedIn to learn more about what they're doing with ShareChange, and then what Kristen is doing with Seeds as well. Especially if you're a financial advisor, Seeds would be potentially interesting for you to reach out. I didn't talk about it much on the show, but that's kind of what Kristen's working on. It's very, very fascinating as well. And then if you are joining us for the first time and you enjoyed the episode, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you can be made aware of future episodes. And of course, we ask that if you did enjoy it, that you would give us a review. It really, really helps us to increase our listenership, especially when we can get those reviews on Apple Podcasts. So thank you so much for tuning into this episode. A quick note, our next episode will be with David Welch, the author of a new book called Charging Ahead, which covers the history of General Motors generally, and how Mary Barra has reshaped the legacy automaker to be focused on EV. David is the Detroit bureau chief at Bloomberg. So generally speaking, really fascinating episode. Be sure to tune in for that soon. And again, thank you so much for tuning in to the Clean Techies podcast. We will see you next time.